Case 1. Antoine Darnique Suggs, The Cornfield. We like to think that friendship is one of the last safe things left in this world. That the people you laugh with, eat with, ride with, those are the people standing between you and the darkness. But what happens when the darkness is already sitting in the passenger seat? On a cold stretch of road, cutting through a Wisconsin cornfield, for people were found dead inside an SUV. Not soldiers, not strangers, friends, people who trusted the person they were with enough to get in that car. And that trust, that ordinary human trust, is exactly what got them killed. Antoine Darnique Suggs wasn't a ghost. He wasn't some shadowy figure lurking at the edges of society. He was present. He was known. He moved through St. Paul like someone who belonged there, because to everyone around him, he did. Neighbors knew his face. People in his circle knew his name. He wasn't the kind of man who made your skin crawl when he walked into a room. And that right there is the most terrifying thing about this entire case. Because the monster in this story didn't look like one. I want you to really picture this. For people, one vehicle, a cornfield in Wisconsin that should have had nothing to do with any of their lives. These weren't random victims pulled from a crowd. These were individuals connected to Suggs, connected by proximity, by relationship, by the kind of closeness that makes you lower your guard completely. You don't watch your back around someone you know. You don't brace yourself when the person next to you is supposed to be your people. That's what makes this so deeply, viscerally wrong. Investigators arriving at that scene in 2021 were met with something that defied easy explanation. For bodies, a single location, the kind of deliberate, contained violence that doesn't happen by accident. This wasn't chaos. This wasn't a robbery gone sideways. What happened in that cornfield required planning. It required resolve. It required someone to look at 4 human beings, for people who trusted them, and make a decision. Ask yourself, if 4 of your friends went missing at the same time, in the same car, how long before you'd know something was wrong? Hours? Maybe less. Because when people you love disappear together, the silence is deafening. And yet, for a moment in time, that silence held. The world kept moving. And Antoine Darnique Suggs kept moving with it. This is where it gets truly dark. The systemic reality of cases like this is that by the time law enforcement pieces together the full picture, the window has already closed on the living. Red flags, if there were any, existed in spaces that don't always talk to each other. In conversations, in histories, in patterns of behavior that only make sense in hindsight. For people lost their lives, and the investigation that followed had to reconstruct not just a crime scene, but an entire web of relationships to understand how it came to this. One detail from this case never left the people who worked it. The isolation of that cornfield. The deliberate remoteness of it. Whoever chose that location understood something fundamental. That distance is a tool. That if you take someone far enough from everything familiar, the odds of anyone bearing witness collapse to almost nothing. That cornfield wasn't an accident. It was a choice. And that choice tells you everything about the kind of calculation happening behind Antoine Darnique Suggs's perfectly ordinary face. He was convicted. The legal system arrived at its conclusion. But here's the question that doesn't get answered in any courtroom. How many times did someone cross paths with this man and feel nothing? How many moments existed where the ordinary surface of his life brushed up against other lives and nobody saw it coming? Because that's the lingering horror here. Not just what happened in that cornfield, but the fact that evil, real evil, doesn't announce itself. It rides with you. It knows your name. It waits. And sometimes it's already in the car. Case 2. Terry and Lamar Sherman. The apartment. There's something about the word home that carries weight. We build entire lives around the idea of it. The locked door, the familiar smell, the feeling that whatever is happening outside cannot reach you here. Home is supposed to be the one place where you are most yourself, most protected, most safe. Abigail Simpson was home, and that's exactly where she died. In 2020, in a St. Paul apartment that should have been nothing more than the backdrop of an ordinary life, Abigail Simpson was murdered by the man she was in a relationship with, Terry Lamar Sherman. And the story of how that apartment became a crime scene is a story that starts like so many of these do, long before any violence ever occurs. Turi and Lamar Sherman, by all external appearances, existed within the normal boundaries of everyday life. Relationships, a place to live, a presence in a community. He wasn't a figure of obvious menace. He didn't carry his danger on the outside where people could see it and step back. He was interior, controlled, the kind of person who could stand in a room and let you build your own comfortable, incorrect assumptions about who he was. Abigail Simpson knew him. She was with him. And that intimacy, that closeness, is the very thing that should have been her protection and instead became her vulnerability. I want you to really picture this. An apartment. Two people who are supposed to be in a relationship built on some version of care. And somewhere inside that space, something shifts. A decision gets made. A line gets crossed that cannot be uncrossed. And by the time anyone outside those four walls understands what has happened, Abigail Simpson is already gone. Domestic violence cases carry a particular weight in the true crime space because they force us to reckon with something profoundly uncomfortable. The fact that the most dangerous place for many people is not a dark street or a strange city, is the home they share with someone they chose. The statistics on this are not abstract. They are names. Abigail Simpson is a name. Ask yourself, if someone you were dating went silent, stopped responding, disappeared from their own life, how long before the people around them would sound the alarm? And more painfully, how long before the systems designed to protect people would actually move? Because in cases like this, the warning signs have a habit of existing before the moment of violence. They live in prior incidents, in patterns, in the kind of escalating behavior that makes sense only when you lay it all out in sequence after the worst has already happened. This is where it gets truly dark. The failure in cases of intimate partner violence is rarely a single dramatic breakdown. It is quieter than that. It is the report that didn't result in removal. The call that got logged but not followed up on. The moment where someone in a position of institutional power looked at a situation and made the calculation that it hadn't gotten bad enough yet. For Abigail Simpson, it got bad enough. It got final. There is a detail in cases like this one that never fully leaves you: the intimacy of the location. When violence happens in a place that is supposed to mean safety, it doesn't just destroy the victim. It poisons the concept. Every person who hears a story like Abigail's recalibrates something quiet and internal about what home means, about what closeness means, about what we are actually protected from, and what we have simply convinced ourselves we are protected from. Turi and Lamar Sherman was convicted. The law did what the law does. It named the act, assigned the consequence, and closed the legal chapter of Abigail Simpson's story. But Abigail Simpson's story shouldn't have had that chapter. She should have been home. She was home. And that is the unbearable contradiction at the center of this case. That the place she was supposed to be safest is the place where she needed someone to save her, and no one came in time. We talk about monsters like they come from somewhere outside of ordinary life, like they emerge from darkness and return to it. But Turi and Lamar Sherman lived in an apartment. He had a relationship. He existed in the same world Abigail Simpson existed in, and he moved through it without a sign above his head. That is not a comfort. That is the whole problem. And somewhere tonight, in cities across this country, there are apartments just like that one. There are doors closed on situations that the world outside cannot see. There are people who need the systems around them to work, to actually work. And those systems are, right now, making the same calculations they always make. The question is how many more names we are willing to add to this list before something changes. Abigail Simpson deserved better. She deserved to grow old inside a home that meant what home is supposed to mean. She didn't get that, and we should not let ourselves forget why. Case 3. Joseph Davis, The Knife and the Silence. We talk about love like it is always soft, like it arrives gently and stays that way, warm, consistent, something you can lean into without fear. But there is another version of love that the world doesn't put on greeting cards. A version that is possessive, suffocating, and in its most extreme form, lethal. And Christine Morris lived inside that version. Until May 2025, when she didn't live at all. Joseph Davis was her boyfriend. That word, boyfriend, carries an assumption of care, of protection, of someone who is supposed to be on your side. And on the surface, Davis occupied that role the way people like him always do, casually, convincingly, without obvious warning signs visible to the outside world. He was present in Christine's life. He was close to her. He was, by all appearances, simply a man in a relationship. And then he stabbed her to death. There is something uniquely devastating about a stabbing as opposed to other forms of violence. It is not distant. It is not impersonal. A knife requires proximity. It requires a decision that gets made and remade with every single movement. It is, in the most visceral and unavoidable sense, intimate violence. Whoever uses a knife as a weapon cannot pretend they weren't there, cannot pretend they didn't feel the weight of what they were doing. The closeness is inescapable. The intention is inescapable. Joseph Davis was close to Christine Morris when he killed her. Close enough that she would have seen his face. I want you to really picture this. A woman in what should be the ordinary landscape of her daily life. Her home, her space, the environment she shared with someone she was in a relationship with. And somewhere in that space, something happens. An argument, maybe. A moment of rage that had been building beneath the surface for longer than anyone on the outside knew. And then a knife. And then Christine Morris is gone. And the silence that follows is the kind of silence that screams. This is where it gets truly dark. Because here is what we know about cases like this, about intimate partner homicides that end with a stabbing in a shared living space. The violence almost never begins at the moment it becomes fatal. There is almost always a history, a pattern, moments of escalation that existed before the worst moment, moments that people around the situation may have witnessed or sensed or been told about directly. The question investigators always have to ask is not just what happened in those final moments, but what was the architecture of everything that led there? What did Christine Morris's world look like in the weeks before May 2025? Who knew what? Who saw what? And critically, who was in a position to intervene and didn't? Ask yourself, if someone you cared about was in a relationship that made you uneasy, how far would you go to say something? And if you did say something to them, to someone in authority, to anyone who might be able to help, would it be enough? Would the systems around that person actually respond in time? Or would the response come later, after the fact, reconstructing a timeline that only makes terrible sense in reverse? The answer to that question, in too many cases, is the same. The response comes too late. The intervention that might have mattered happens after the moment where it could have changed anything. There is a detail about stabbing cases that investigators and forensic professionals carry with them long after the case is closed. The evidence of struggle. The physical reality of what happens when a person fights for their life in an enclosed space. The marks left not just on the victim, but on the scene itself. Overturned furniture. Defensive wounds. The story that surfaces right on the walls and floors of a space that was supposed to be private. That evidence is clinical when you read it in a report. It is something else entirely when you understand that every piece of it represents a moment in which Christine Morris was still fighting, still present, still trying to survive. She deserved to survive. Joseph Davis was charged with her murder. The legal process began its long, slow machinery. But the legal process cannot give Christine Morris back to the people who loved her. It cannot undo the silence that fell over that apartment in May 2025. It cannot answer the questions that will follow her family and friends for the rest of their lives. The what-ifs, the if-onlys, the devastating replaying of moments where something might have been different. What we can do is refuse to look away from what this case represents. Intimate partner violence does not live in the margins of society. It does not happen only in certain neighborhoods or certain income brackets or certain kinds of relationships. It happens in ordinary apartments, in ordinary cities, between people who are known to each other and to the world around them. Christine Morris had a name. She had a life. She had people who loved her and a future that someone else decided to take from her with a knife in a space that should have been safe. That is not a statistic. That is a person. And the least we can do is say her name like we mean it. Case 4. Terry Lorenzo, Brown Jr. The night the music stopped. There are places in every city that become more than just locations. They become symbols. They become the places where a community gathers to exhale, to step outside of the weight of daily life, and simply exist in shared space, shared sound, shared humanity. The 7th Street Truck Park Bar in St. Paul was one of those places. An outdoor venue. Music. People coming together on a summer night, because that is what people do when they want to feel alive. Marisha Wiley, known to everyone who loved her as Kiki, went there in 2021 because she wanted to enjoy a night out. She never came home. Terry Lorenzo Brown Jr. did not go to the 7th Street Truck Park that night to find Kiki. He did not go there because of anything she had done or said or represented. She was not a target in any calculated sense. She was simply present. She was simply there in the wrong place at the moment when Brown made a decision to introduce a firearm into a crowded public space and use it. And that randomness, that absolute, devastating randomness, is its own particular species of horror. Because if Kiki Wiley had left 5 minutes earlier, if she had been standing 10 feet in another direction, if any single variable in that night had been even slightly different, she goes home. She wakes up the next morning. She continues her life. The people who loved her don't spend the rest of their lives carrying the weight of a loss that made no sense and never will. But she didn't leave 5 minutes earlier, and she was standing exactly where she was standing. And Terry Lorenzo Brown Jr. was there with a gun. I want you to really picture this. An outdoor bar, music playing, the kind of warm weather gathering that feels safe precisely because of the number of people present, because crowds feel protective, feel communal, feel like the kind of environment where the worst things don't happen. And then gunfire, and then screaming, and then the music stops, and the night becomes something that everyone who survived it will never fully leave. Kiki Wiley was a bystander. That word carries so much weight in cases like this. It means she had no part in whatever conflict or confrontation preceded the shooting. It means she was there as herself, a person, a daughter, a friend, someone with a life full of specific, irreplaceable details, and she was taken from all of it by violence that had nothing to do with her. This is where it gets truly dark. The phenomenon of gun violence in public spaces, particularly in entertainment districts, in the outdoor venues and gathering spots that communities rely on, is not new. Cities across America have watched their public spaces become sites of trauma, watched communities retreat from the places they used to gather freely, watched the slow erosion of the feeling that you can simply go out and come back. And each time it happens, there's a conversation about security, about guns, about what should have been in place, about the gap between what we say we value and what our systems actually protect. At the 7th Street Truck Park, on the night Kiki Wiley was shot, there were real questions to be asked about what security measures existed, what protocols were in place, what might have made a difference. Those questions matter not to assign blame to a venue, but because Kiki Wiley's death created an obligation to do better, to think harder, to refuse to accept that this is simply the cost of public life in an American city. Ask yourself, when was the last time you went somewhere crowded and felt completely, unambiguously safe? Not just assumed you were safe, but genuinely, without any quiet background awareness, felt it? Because here is what cases like this do to communities. They install a low hum of dread in places that used to feel free. They make people calculate risk at venues and events and gatherings where no one should have to calculate anything. They take something communal and make it conditional. Kiki Wiley did not make that calculation on the night she died. She trusted the space. She trusted the night. She went out to enjoy music with other human beings, and that trust cost her everything. There's a detail from this case that stays with you. Not the forensic specifics, but the conceptual image of it. A crowded outdoor venue. People pressed together in the way people press together when they're happy, when they're present, when they're enjoying something. And somewhere in that crowd, a gun. The contrast between those two realities, the joy of the gathering and the concealed potential for devastation within it, is almost impossible to hold in your mind at once. But that contrast is the reality. That contrast is what Kiki Wiley walked into without knowing. Terry Lorenzo Brown Jr. was convicted. The verdict came. The sentence followed. The legal record now contains the official account of what happened at the 7th Street Truck Park in 2021. And Marisha Wiley's name is in that record too. As a victim, as a statistic, as a data point in the long, grim accounting of gun violence in American cities. But she was not a data point. She was Kiki. She had people who called her that name because she was specific and beloved and irreplaceable in all the ways that the legal record can never fully capture. The music stopped that night. For everyone in that venue, for everyone in Kiki's life, for everyone who heard what happened and felt it land in the place where fear lives, the music stopped. And some silences, once they fall, never fully lift. Case 5. Antonio Dupree Wright, the man the jury couldn't touch. We like to believe that the justice system is a net, that when someone commits an act of violence against another human being, that net catches them, holds them, delivers the consequence that the victims and their families are owed. We like to believe that. We need to believe that, because the alternative, that the net has holes wide enough for the guilty to walk through, is a thought that is very difficult to sit with. Antonio Dupree Wright made it through the net, at least partially. And the story of how that happened is a story about evidence, about alibi, about the fragile architecture of what we can prove versus what we believe to be true, and about what it costs the living when that architecture fails. Wright's legal history is not simple. It does not fit into the clean narrative of arrest, trial, conviction, closure that we want from these stories. What it fits into instead is something far more complicated and far more disturbing. A portrait of a man connected to serious violence who faced the full weight of the legal system and walked away from the heaviest charge against him because of an alibi. A triple homicide on Case Avenue. 3 people dead. And Antonio Dupree Wright standing on the other side of a verdict that said, not guilty. He was convicted of other things. Kidnapping. Attempted murder. The system did reach him, did hold him accountable for documented acts of violence that left real people damaged and traumatized. But on the triple homicide, the case that represented the most devastating alleged act of violence attached to his name, the jury came back, and Wright walked away from it. I want you to really picture this. 3 people killed on Case Avenue. Investigators building a case, following evidence, constructing what they believed was a prosecutable connection to Antonio Dupree Wright. Families of those victims sitting in the reality of their loss, waiting for a legal process to deliver something that looks like justice. And then an alibi, a piece of the evidentiary puzzle that creates enough reasonable doubt that 12 people cannot unanimously agree on guilt. Not guilty is not the same as innocent. Every lawyer will tell you that. Every person who has sat close to a criminal case understands the distinction on a cellular level. Not guilty means the prosecution could not meet its burden. It means the evidence, as presented, left enough space for doubt to live. It does not mean nothing happened. It does not mean the families of those 3 victims on Case Avenue were wrong to want answers. It means the system, operating by its own rules, could not close the door all the way. This is where it gets truly dark, because the alibi defense in violent criminal cases is one of the most contested and emotionally combustible elements of the entire legal process. When it works, when it results in an acquittal, there are 2 possible realities. Either an innocent person was saved from a wrongful conviction, which is the system working exactly as it should, or a guilty person identified a way to create enough distance between themselves and the evidence to escape accountability, and 3 families go home without justice. We cannot know, from the outside, which reality applies to Antonio Dupree Wright and the Case Avenue homicides. What we can know is that the outcome landed on the families of those victims like a verdict against them. That the words "not guilty" read aloud in a courtroom echoed very differently in the ears of people who lost someone than they did anywhere else in that room. Ask yourself, if someone you loved was among those 3 victims and you watched a man walk out of a courtroom acquitted of their murder, what would that do to your relationship with the concept of justice? Would you still believe in the system? Would you still trust the net? Or would you carry, for the rest of your life, a specific an irreducible anger at the gap between what you know in your bones and what 12 people could be persuaded to agree on in a jury room. That is not a hypothetical for the families connected to this case. That is their life. And Antonio Dupree, right, did not emerge from his legal history unscathed. The kidnapping conviction, the attempted murder conviction, these are not minor footnotes. They represent real acts of violence against real people, and the system did respond to them. He is not a free man walking the streets of St. Paul. The net did catch him, just not for everything it may have been designed to catch him for. There is something about Wright's case that sits in the mind differently than a straightforward conviction story. It is more uncomfortable. It asks harder questions, not just about him, but about the system that produced this outcome, about what we ask investigators to prove, about the standard of evidence we require before we take a person's freedom, about the way alibi evidence functions in a courtroom, and how it can be constructed, challenged, and ultimately believed or disbelieved by people who weren't there. The visceral detail in this case is not a physical object or a smell or a sound. It is the silence in a courtroom after a not guilty verdict on a murder charge, the intake of breath from the families, the stillness before the reaction. That moment, that specific suspended moment, is one of the most devastating sounds in the entire architecture of the legal system, because it is the sound of something irrevocable landing on people who have already lost too much. 3 people died on Case Avenue. Antonio Dupree, right, was acquitted of killing them. He was convicted of other violent crimes and is serving time for those. And somewhere, the families of those 3 victims are living inside an outcome they did not choose and cannot change. The net has holes. We know that. We have always known that. But knowing it in the abstract and watching it happen in the specific case of people you loved are 2 entirely different kinds of knowing. And the difference between those 2 kinds of knowing is where justice ends and grief begins. Case 6, Rakai Eugene Davis, the predator in plain sight. There is a particular kind of fear that lives in the body differently from other fears. Not the fear of a sudden, catastrophic event, the crash, the collision, the moment of violence that announces itself loudly. This is quieter, slower, the kind of fear that rewires the way you move through familiar spaces, the way you assess a parking lot at night, the way you recalculate your route home, the way you stop trusting the ordinary world to be as safe as it looks. Rakai Eugene Davis installed that fear in women across St. Paul between 2023 and 2024, and he did it repeatedly, methodically, in a pattern that speaks not to impulse but to something far colder, to a person who understood what he was doing and chose to keep doing it. Serial offending in the context of violent sexual assault is, by its very nature, a statement. Not a verbal one, but a behavioral one. Every repeated act says something about the internal calculus of the person committing it, says that the first time did not produce enough fear of consequence to stop, that the second time didn't either, that whatever risk existed in the environment, whatever chance of being caught, identified, prosecuted, it was not sufficient to override the decision to continue. Serial predators are not people who lost control once. They are people who made a choice, got away with it, and made it again. Rakai Eugene Davis was charged in connection with several violent sexual assaults across a period spanning 2023 into 2024. Multiple victims, multiple incidents, a timeline that, when laid out in sequence, represents not a single catastrophic failure judgment, but an extended, sustained pattern of predatory behavior carried out against women who had every right to move through their lives without becoming targets. I want you to really picture this. A city, ordinary streets, ordinary neighborhoods, the kind of urban landscape that thousands of people navigate every single day without incident. And moving through that landscape, largely invisible, a man who had already victimized at least one person and was actively seeking the next. The women who encountered Rakai Eugene Davis during this period did not know what was coming. They were simply living their lives, going where they needed to go, existing in the city the way anyone exists in a city, without the knowledge that someone had already made a decision about them before they ever crossed paths. That is the architecture of predatory violence. It is not random in the way we sometimes comfort ourselves by imagining violence to be random. It is selected. It is deliberate. The victim feels the randomness because they had no part in the selection. But for the person doing the selecting, it is anything but. This is where it gets truly dark. Serial sexual violence cases carry a systemic failure dimension that is both well documented and deeply enraging. Because between the first assault and the last in a series, there is almost always a window. A period of time in which, if the right information reached the right people and was acted upon with appropriate urgency, subsequent victims might have been protected. Reports get made. Cases get opened. Investigations begin. And in that gap between the beginning of the process and the moment it produces a result, the predator continues to move. Ask yourself, if you were the second victim in a series of assaults and you later learned that a report had already been filed by someone before you, that a case was already open, that the person who hurt you was already known to investigators, what would that knowledge do to you? Would it produce relief that the system was working? Or would it produce a specific, burning anger at the pace of that work, at the distance between the opening of a case and the moment it becomes prevention rather than documentation? For women victimized by Rakai Eugene Davis after the first incident in his pattern, that question is not abstract. It is the question they may ask themselves for the rest of their lives. There is a visceral detail embedded in sexual assault cases that does not get discussed enough in the mainstream true crime space, and it is the ongoing, daily reality of survival for the victims. A homicide case ends in a death. The victim's suffering, as devastating as that truth is, terminates at a single point. Sexual assault survivors do not have that terrible finality. They carry the assault forward into every subsequent relationship, every intimate space, every moment of vulnerability. The crime extends beyond its moment. It follows the victim through time in a way that the perpetrator, once arrested, no longer has to confront. Rakai Eugene Davis was charged. The legal machinery engaged. His pattern of behavior was documented, named, and entered into the official record of what he chose to do to other human beings over the course of more than a year in St. Paul. But the women he victimized do not get to close a case file. They do not get to reach a verdict and move on. They live in the aftermath of his choices in a way that is ongoing, evolving, and deeply personal. Each of them is navigating a recovery that belongs entirely to them, that is as specific and individual as they are, and that will take whatever time it takes, shaped by resources and support systems that may or may not be adequate to what they are carrying. Serial predators rely on something fundamental about social trust to operate. They rely on the fact that most people, most of the time, are not scanning their environment for threats. That most women walking down a St. Paul street in 2023 or 2024 were not thinking about Rakai Eugene Davis. Why would they be? He was not announced. He was not visible. He moved through the world with the same surface normalcy that allowed him to get close enough to cause harm before anyone understood what was happening. That is not a failure of the victims. That is a feature of predatory behavior. It depends on the baseline trust that holds communities together and exploits it. The city of St. Paul had a predator moving through it for over a year. Women were hurt. Cases were filed. And eventually, the system reached him. But eventually is a word that contains multitudes. It contains the time that passed, the incidents that occurred within that time, the lives that were altered within that time, the fear that was installed in the bodies of women who will carry it long after Rakai Eugene Davis's legal case is resolved. Eventually is not soon enough. It is never soon enough. And until we are willing to have a genuine, uncomfortable conversation about how we resource and prioritize investigations into serial sexual violence, about how quickly we move, how seriously we take the first report, how urgently we treat the possibility of a repeat offender, eventually will keep coming too late for the people who needed it to be now. Rakai Eugene Davis made a choice. Over and over again, he made it. And every time he did, another woman's life changed in ways she did not ask for and did not deserve. Say that out loud. Sit with it. And then ask yourself what kind of city, what kind of system, what kind of collective commitment to one another might have made him stop sooner. Case 7. John Lee Edmondson, the memorial and the bullet. We gather at memorials because grief is too heavy to carry alone. We show up for each other in the hardest moments, standing together in the specific, sacred space of collective mourning, because that is what human beings do when someone they love is gone. A memorial service is supposed to be untouchable. It is supposed to be the one moment where the violence that took someone pauses long enough for the living to say goodbye. In 2023, that assumption was shattered in St. Paul. At a gathering held in memory of someone already lost, John Lee Edmondson made a decision that took another life. Larry Giles, Jr. was present at that memorial. Present in the way people are present at those gatherings, with his guard down, his grief forward, his attention on the shared purpose of honoring someone gone. And Edmondson killed him there, at a memorial, in a space consecrated by sorrow. Let that land where it needs to land. John Lee Edmondson, before this moment, existed in the ordinary social fabric of his community. He was not an abstraction. He was a person known to people, connected to the networks of relationship and history that bind communities together, particularly in neighborhoods where everyone's lives overlap in ways that outsiders rarely understand. He moved through that world with the kind of familiarity that comes from belonging to a place, from being recognized, from having history there. And he brought a gun to a memorial service. I want you to really picture this. The specific atmosphere of a gathering like that. The low voices. The photographs of the person being mourned. The way grief makes people soft and open and present with each other in a way that ordinary days don't always allow. The children who may have been there. The older relatives. The friends standing together, because standing together is the only thing that makes any of it bearable. That is the environment into which John Lee Edmondson introduced lethal violence. The desecration of that space is not incidental to the crime. It is central to it. This is where it gets truly dark. There is a pattern in American urban violence that criminologists and community leaders have discussed for years. The phenomenon of violence at gatherings, at vigils, at the very events organized in response to prior violence. It is one of the most circular and devastating features of concentrated community trauma. A shooting occurs. People gather to grieve. And sometimes the gathering itself becomes the site of the next incident. The violence feeds itself. It disrupts even the spaces created to process it. And every time it happens, it sends a message to the community that there's no safe ground, that even grief is not protected. Ask yourself, what does it do to a community when the act of mourning becomes dangerous? When people have to calculate, even subconsciously, whether showing up to honor someone they've lost might put them at risk. When the instinct to gather, to be present, to say goodbye is shadowed by awareness of what gathering can sometimes invite. That calculation, that quiet, exhausting, impossible calculation, is the real tax that this kind of violence levies on communities. Not just the individual incident, but the cumulative weight of living in a world where even the sacred moments are not safe. The visceral detail in this case is the sound of a gunshot inside a space already vibrating with grief. The way that sound would have moved through a crowd of people who were already broken, already raw, already at the outermost edge of what human beings can absorb emotionally. The way it would have transformed one kind of emergency, the emergency of collective loss, into another kind entirely. Screaming where there had been quiet weeping, running where there had been stillness. The complete, violent rupture of the one space that was supposed to hold everyone together. Larry Giles, Jr. came to a memorial. He came because someone he knew was gone, and he wanted to be present in his grief. That is not a complicated or unusual thing. That is a deeply human thing, and it cost him his life. John Lee Edmondson was convicted. The legal record reflects what happened, assigns the label, delivers the consequence. But the community that gathered that day at that memorial carries something the legal record cannot process. The memory of what it felt like when the gunshots split the air, when the grief they had come to share was suddenly compounded by new and immediate terror, when another person they knew collapsed and did not get up. Communities are not made of legal records. They're made of memory, of accumulated experience, of the way certain events mark time, before and after. For the people at that memorial in 2023, there is a before and an after. And the line between them is a gunshot fired by John Lee Edmondson in a space that should have been, by every measure of basic human decency, off limits. There are places that should be sanctuaries. Grief is one of them. John Lee Edmondson walked into that sanctuary and destroyed it. And somewhere, the people who survived that day are still trying to finish mourning, carrying two losses now instead of one, in a space inside themselves that never got to close properly because someone with a gun made sure it couldn't. 8. John C. Adams 2. The house that was supposed to be safe. Adult foster care exists because some people cannot navigate the world alone. Because injury, illness, disability, or the long accumulated weight of circumstance has created a need for structured support. For a home environment where vulnerable people can live with some measure of dignity, care, and protection. The entire premise of that system is safety. It is the foundational promise made to the people who enter it and to the families who trust it with their loved ones. In 2020, inside one of those homes in St. Paul, that promise was broken in the most irreversible way possible. John C. Adams, too, stabbed a fellow resident to death. Not a stranger encountered in a public space. Not someone from outside the walls of the home. A person he lived with. A person who existed in the same structured, supposedly supervised environment. A person who, like Adams, was there because the system had determined that this was where they needed to be, and the system put them in the same space. And one of them is dead. Let that sit with you for a moment. John C. Adams, too, was a resident of an adult foster care facility. Whatever circumstances brought him there, whatever history, whatever needs, whatever assessment was done prior to his placement, the system made a determination that this was an appropriate environment for him. That the level of supervision and structure available in that home was adequate for his presence there. That he and the other residents could coexist safely within those walls. That determination was catastrophically wrong. I want you to really picture this. An adult foster care home. Not a prison, not a hospital, a home, with common spaces and bedrooms, and the kind of domestic texture that is deliberately constructed to feel as normal and supportive as possible. The residents there are not anonymous. They know each other. They share meals, share spaces, share the daily rhythms of life in close proximity. The staff know their names. There's supposed to be a layer of oversight and attention that exists precisely because these are people who need it. And in 2020, somewhere inside that texture of ordinary domestic life, John C. Adams, too, produced a knife and killed the person who lived there alongside him. This is where it gets truly dark. The question that this case forces into the open is one that the adult foster care system has historically been reluctant to fully confront. The question of assessment, of placement, of what happens when the evaluation of a resident's risk level is either inadequate or ignored in practice, even when it is documented on paper. Adult foster care facilities vary enormously in their resources, their staffing levels, their capacity for supervision and crisis intervention. Some are exceptionally well run. Others are operating at the absolute margins of what constitutes adequate care, with staff stretched too thin and protocols that exist in binders on shelves, but not consistently in practice. When a homicide occurs inside one of these facilities, the immediate legal question is about the individual who committed the act. But the systemic question, the question that the victim's family deserves to have answered, is about the environment, about who made the decision to place these two individuals together, about what information was available at the time of that decision, about whether any behavioral warning signs existed prior to the fatal incident, and, if so, what was done in response to them. Ask yourself, if your family member was a resident in an adult foster care home, what would you want to know about the other people living there? What information would you consider yourself entitled to? And more pointedly, if something happened to them inside that home, at the hands of another resident, would you feel that the system had protected them the way it promised it would? For the family of the person killed by John C. Adams, too, in 2020, that question is not hypothetical. They trusted a system. They placed someone they loved inside a structured environment specifically because it was supposed to provide the safety and oversight that independent living could not. And that person was killed inside that supposedly safe environment by the person living in the next room. The visceral detail that lives inside this case is the domestic setting itself. A kitchen knife or whatever implement was used existing in a space designed to feel like home, because it was supposed to feel like home. The ordinary objects of daily life becoming instruments of violence within the very walls constructed to protect vulnerable people from exactly that. There is something profoundly destabilizing about violence that occurs inside spaces explicitly designated as safe. It doesn't just destroy the individual victims. It corrodes the concept of the safe space itself, makes it impossible to look at that environment the same way again. John C. Adams, too, was convicted of the stabbing murder. The legal process reached its conclusion. He was held accountable in the way that the legal system holds people accountable. But the person he killed deserved better than accountability after the fact. They deserved a system that identified the risk before it became lethal. They deserved supervision adequate to the environment they were living in. They deserved to have the foundational promise of the adult foster care system: safety, dignity, protection, honored in practice rather than violated in the most permanent way imaginable. Vulnerable people placed in adult care settings are among the least visible members of our society. Their lives, their experiences, their safety, these things do not generate headlines until something goes catastrophically wrong. And then, briefly, we ask questions, we note the failure, and then the attention moves on, and the next placement decision gets made with the same inadequate information and the same stretched resources and the same gap between what the system promises and what it actually delivers. John C. Adams, too, killed someone who was supposed to be protected. The system that placed them together failed the person who died. Both of those things are true simultaneously, and both of them demand a response that goes beyond a single conviction. Because somewhere right now, in adult foster care homes across this country, assessments are being made. Placements are being decided. People are being put into proximity with one another based on evaluations that may or may not capture the full picture of what that proximity means for everyone involved. And the person who pays the price when those evaluations are wrong is never the system. It is always the most vulnerable person in the room. Case 9. John Robert Capers, the ghost of 1992. There are crimes that don't end when the perpetrator walks away. They continue. They persist. They live inside the people left behind like a splinter buried too deep to reach. Present every single day, invisible to everyone else, a constant low-grade agony that the outside world eventually stops acknowledging because time has passed and people assume that time heals what it actually just buries. Annette Gail Seymour was murdered in 1992. For 30 years, nobody was held accountable. Let that number settle into your bones. 30 years. 3 decades of a family carrying the weight of an unanswered question. 3 decades of birthdays that came and went without her. 3 decades of a case file sitting somewhere in a system that had moved on to newer emergencies, while the people who loved Annette remained frozen in the year she was taken from them. 30 years is not a statistic. 30 years is a life sentence for the people left behind, handed to them without trial, without appeal, without any mechanism for relief. And then DNA changed everything. I want you to really picture this. A cold case detective or forensic investigator working through old evidence with technology that did not exist when Annette Seymour was killed. The careful, painstaking process of extracting biological material from evidence that had been sitting in storage since 1992, since before the internet was in every home, since before the mapping of the human genome, since before the databases existed that could take a DNA profile and search it against a population of known offenders. And then a match. A name. John Robert Capers. The moment a cold case produces a match after 30 years is one of the most electrically charged moments in all of law enforcement. It is the simultaneous collapse of time, the past rushing into the present, the dormant case suddenly alive again, the name of a victim who had waited 3 decades for this moment finally attached to a suspect who could be found, charged, brought into a courtroom. For Annette Seymour's family, that moment must have contained something close to impossible hope. After 30 years of nothing, suddenly, something, a name, a face, a person to hold responsible for the thing that had been destroying them quietly for 3 decades. The legal process began. Capers was tried, and then the jury returned its verdict. Not guilty. This is where it gets truly dark. The acquittal of John Robert Capers in 2022, 30 years after the murder of Annette Gail Seymour, after a DNA match that brought the case back from the dead, is one of the most devastating legal outcomes in this entire compilation. Not because the jury was necessarily wrong to apply reasonable doubt. The standard exists for necessary and important reasons, and DNA evidence, while extraordinarily powerful, operates within a legal framework that requires more than a match to convict. Questions about the integrity of decades-old evidence. Questions about chain of custody. Questions about what the DNA proves and what it cannot prove beyond the margin that the law requires. All of those questions are legitimate. All of them are exactly the kind of questions a defense attorney is supposed to ask. The system, in one sense, was working exactly as designed. But Annette Seymour's family did not experience an abstract legal principle on the day that verdict was read. They experienced the second erasure of justice in their lives. The first erasure was 1992, when the crime occurred and no one was caught. The second was 2022, when the person identified by DNA as connected to the case walked out of the courtroom acquitted. Ask yourself, what do you do with 30 years of waiting when the waiting ends not in justice, but in another closed door? What do you say to the members of a family who held on through 3 decades of silence, who allowed themselves to hope when a DNA match was announced, who sat through a trial and watched and waited again, and then watched the man the science pointed to walk free? What language exists for that? What comfort is available? What does the system offer them at that point besides the hollow acknowledgement that the process was followed correctly? The visceral detail embedded in this case is the evidence itself. Physical material collected in 1992, handled in 1992, stored for 30 years in conditions that may or may not have been consistently ideal, carrying within it the biological signature that could name a killer, but existing in a legal framework where naming and proving are 2 entirely different and not always compatible things. That evidence sat in storage while Annette Seymour's family aged, while the people who loved her went through the ordinary passages of life, marriages, children, losses of their own, carrying her absence through all of it. And when that evidence finally spoke, the legal system listened and then decided it wasn't enough. Cold case investigations are among the most emotionally complex work in law enforcement. The detectives who pursue them do so with the knowledge that the families waiting for answers have already been waiting too long. That every day without resolution is another day of an open wound that cannot begin to close. The advances in forensic technology over the past 3 decades have been genuinely extraordinary. DNA databases, familial searching, genetic genealogy, luminol and touch DNA, and techniques that would have seemed like science fiction in 1992. These tools have solved cases that seemed permanently unsolvable. They have given families answers they had stopped believing would ever come. But they operate within a legal system that has its own requirements. And sometimes, not always, but sometimes, the gap between what the science can show and what the law can prove is wide enough for an acquittal to fall through. John Robert Capers was tried and found not guilty of the 1992 murder of Annette Gail Seymour. The case is now, in legal terms, closed. Capers cannot be tried again for this crime. The protection against double jeopardy, one of the foundational principles of American criminal law, means that regardless of any evidence that might emerge in the future, the legal chapter on this specific case is finished. Annette Seymour's family lives with that finality now. A different kind of finality than justice would have provided. The finality of a door that has closed permanently on the possibility of accountability for the person identified by DNA as connected to her murder. 30 years they waited for that door to open. They watched it open. They watched the process unfold. And then they watched it close again in a way it can never be reopened. There are crimes that don't end. There are families that never fully get to begin again. And there are moments in the justice system that reveal, with brutal clarity, the distance between what we promise the victims of violence and what we are actually capable of delivering. Annette Gail Seymour deserved justice in 1992. She deserved it in 2022. She deserves it now. The law has spoken, but the debt remains, and no verdict, not guilty or otherwise, has the power to settle it. Case 10. Michael Kintrell Smith, the artist and the aftermath. There are people whose lives exist as a kind of light, not in a sentimental or abstract way, but in the specific concrete sense that their presence in the world generates something, art, warmth, connection, the particular kind of energy that makes the spaces they inhabit feel more alive than they were before. Amber Denning was that kind of person, an artist, someone who took the raw material of human experience and made something from it that other people could see and feel and carry with them. She was killed on a November night in 2025 by a vehicle driven by Michael Kintrell Smith. And then he kept driving. Let that settle. The hit and run is a specific category of violence that carries its own particular moral weight. It is not, in most legal frameworks, classified alongside premeditated homicide. It occupies a different space in the taxonomy of crime, one that the law treats differently, that sentences differently, that discusses differently. But the person who is struck and left on the ground does not experience a legal category. They experience the full and final weight of what has happened to them. And the person who drives away makes a choice in that moment. A choice that is not panicked and instantaneous, as people sometimes characterize it, but a choice that continues to be made with every mile of distance put between the driver and the body left behind. Michael Kintrell Smith drove away from Amber Denning. I want you to really picture this. A November night, an artist moving through her city, through the streets that informed her work, that existed as the backdrop of the life she was building, that were as familiar to her as her own hands. And then impact, and then the sound of an engine accelerating away, and then silence. The particular devastating silence of a person lying on pavement in the dark while the person responsible for what happened to them is already somewhere else, already calculating, already choosing the distance that they hope will save them from accountability. Amber Denning was an artist. That detail matters not because artists are worth more than other people. They are not. Every life carries equal weight. But because art is one of the ways human beings make themselves known to the world beyond their immediate circle. It is the mechanism by which a person's interior life reaches other people, by which something essential about who they are survives the ordinary erosions of time and distance. When an artist is killed, the loss is layered. The person themselves, and also everything they would have gone on to create. Every piece that existed in potential inside them, in ideas not yet executed, in directions not yet explored, in a specific and irreplaceable vision that belonged to them alone. All of that was on that street in November 2025. All of it left behind when Michael Kintrell Smith kept driving. This is where it gets truly dark. Hit-and-run fatalities occupy a troubling space in the public conversation about traffic violence. We discuss drunk driving with appropriate gravity. We have campaigns, legislation, cultural consensus around its seriousness. But the driver who flees a scene, who strikes a person and makes the active, continuing decision to abandon them, sometimes gets treated in public discourse as though the fleeing is the primary crime and the death is secondary. As though the moral weight concentrates on the act of leaving rather than on the act that made leaving a consideration in the first place. Amber Denning did not die because Michael Kintrell Smith drove away. She died because he struck her. The flight from the scene compounded the crime, eliminated any possibility that immediate intervention might have made a difference, and demonstrated in the clearest possible terms the priority structure operating in Smith's mind in those moments. His own safety above the life of the person he had just hit. Ask yourself, in the seconds after causing a collision that you know in your body has seriously hurt another person, what would you do? The question seems to have an obvious answer when posed in the abstract, in the safety of ordinary life, removed from the adrenaline and the fear and the self-preserving calculus that kicks in at moments of crisis. Most people, pose the question hypothetically, say they would stop, would call for help, would stay. But Michael Cantrell Smith did not stay, and Amber Denning died. The visceral detail in this case is the aftermath of the scene itself. The physical evidence that a person was there, was struck, was left. The marks on the road. The personal belongings scattered in the way they scatter when a human body is subjected to sudden violent impact. The intimacy of those objects, whatever Amber Denning was carrying, whatever was in her pockets or her bag, the small, ordinary artifacts of a life in motion, lying on the pavement of a St. Paul Street in November while the person responsible drove further and further away. Those objects are the evidence, but they are also, in a way that evidence photographs cannot fully capture, the remains of a person's ordinary evening. The last material record of Amber Denning in motion, in her city, living her life. Michael Cantrell Smith was charged in connection with her death. The legal process engaged. The machinery of accountability began its slow, necessary work. And the St. Paul artistic community, the people who knew Amber's work, who had been touched by her vision, who understood what had been lost in terms that went beyond the personal to the cultural, began the separate and no less important work of grieving. There is something about the timing of this case, November 2025, that carries its own weight in the context of this documentary. It is the most recent case in this compilation. The wounds are the freshest. The legal process is the least resolved. The people who loved Amber Denning are in the earliest stages of a grief that will reshape itself over years and decades into something they can carry, but that right now is still in its rawest, most acute form. The artist is gone. The work she would have made is gone with her. The streets she moved through are still there, still lit at night the same way they were lit the night she was killed, still filled with people going places and coming home and living the ordinary, irreplaceable texture of their lives. Amber Denning should be among them. She was an artist. She was a person. She was someone's daughter, someone's friend, someone's community. She was present in her city in a way that made it richer, and Michael Cantrell Smith's decision, not just the impact, but the flight, the choice to keep going, removed that presence permanently. We started this documentary in the most notorious corners of St. Paul's criminal history, with cases that spanned decades and courtrooms and verdicts and the long, complicated aftermath of violence. We end here, in 2025, with an artist on a November street and a driver who did not stop. Some things do not change. The violence finds new forms, new names, new victims who deserve better from the world and from the people in it. Amber Denning deserved better. Say her name, remember what she made, and ask yourself what kind of city, what kind of community, what kind of collective responsibility to one another might have kept her here. The answer to that question is not in a courtroom. It is in us. And that is the most haunting truth of all.